Welcome to our webcast, How CFOs and HR Leaders Collaborate to Align Financial and Human Capital. Brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Workday and PwC. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. Now, before we get started, I would like to cover a few features of the console that you're viewing. I'd note that on the left side of your console, you will be able to view slides and respond to polls. In a moment, I'll go over how you would respond to polls when they appear. In the meantime, I would note that from the resource list area of your console, you will be able to click on a link to download a PDF document that comprises slides from our webcast, as well as click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person. Now, although we will plan to dedicate the latter portion of our webcast to addressing your questions, we do invite you to type in your questions and comments at any time during our webcast in the Q&A area of your console. Now, those who join our live webcast will have the opportunity to earn a certificate representing one continuing professional education or CPE credit. To be eligible, we ask that you respond to all three polling questions we'll intersperse throughout our webcast. To respond to a polling question when it appears, we ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the Submit button so we can record your response. After we have posed our last, that is our third polling question during our webcast, if you have answered all three polling questions and are therefore eligible to receive credit, you will be able to click on an icon to download your certificate, and that'll be located in the certification section of your console. And if you are attending our live webcast and have answered all three polling questions but are not able to retrieve your certificate, you will be able to do so when this webcast is available on demand later this week within the webcast section of CFO.com. I'd like to tell you about our very distinguished guests who are joining us today, and they are Lori Priest and Mike Park of PwC and Chris Artemenko of Workday. By way of background, Lori Priest, who is a director with PwC, is actually, to be more precise, a director with PwC's Workday Financials practice and has more than 20 years of experience in accounting, finance, and payroll. She joined PwC from CEC Entertainment, where she had served as vice president, controller, and chief accounting officer. And Lori's experience includes financial transformations, including mergers and acquisitions, as well as spin-offs, divestitures, and dissolutions, and she herself led CEC Entertainment through all aspects of its going private transaction, from solicitations of interest, due diligence, proxy solicitation, and bond offering to purchase accounting, acceleration of stock, and valuation. And joining Lori from PwC, also a director, is Mike Park. He's a director with PwC's Workday practice and has more than 18 years of experience driving large-scale, high-visibility programs and projects from conception to implementation for large and mid-sized organizations, including more than a decade of executive-level experience working with major domestic and global corporations in a variety of industries. And we will also hear valuable perspective, and this will be during a discussion later on during our webcast from Chris Artemenko. She's a strategic advisor, financial services industry with Workday, and in that role, in her role as Workday's strategic advisor for companies in the financial services industry, including companies that provide banking, insurance, investment management, and other financial services, Chris works with prospects and clients, advocating within Workday for the needs of financial services companies. Now, during this webcast, just so you're aware, we will hear perspectives from Lori and Mike of PwC about how CFOs and HR leaders can align financial and human capital. We'll then conduct an in-depth discussion about this very topic with Lori and Mike of PwC and with Chris of Workday. Before we hear from Lori and Mike of PwC, I would like to pose the first of our three polling questions. And our very first polling question asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement that your company has the data it needs to inform decisions about how to recruit and retain top talent. What you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the Submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. And what we'll do is give attendees sufficient time to respond. We'll then summarize how you have responded. And then we will begin or hear from Mike and Lori of PwC. We'll begin hearing from them. But first, I want to give attendees sufficient time to respond. Again, we ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the Submit button so we can record the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement that your company has the data it needs to inform decisions about how to recruit and retain top talent. So just a few more seconds, and then we will reveal how you have responded. And what is already becoming apparent among respondents is that, the good news is that a majority agree. That's clear. But I would acknowledge that more than a quarter disagree, and there's always the opportunity to move the needle. With that in mind, and at this stage, it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Mike and Lori. We will first hear from Mike. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Mike and Lori of PwC. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike from PwC. Thank you, Joe. So it's interesting to talk about whether or not you have the data you need. It was very interesting to see the results that 51% thought they had agreed and a few more strongly agreed, but still a quarter of the organization didn't believe they had the right information to drive decisions within their organization. And that's typically what we're starting to see. And as you can see, this is an opportunity for organizations to really evolve, to really drive greater business value. And CFOs and the finance, and as well as CHROs and the HR organizations have a unique opportunity to play a very significant role in this evolution. I think what you typically think about, there's really 4 areas as you think about reporting within an organization that we typically see, think about where you fall amongst that reporting evolution. First is around the ability to support decisions, right? This, I think, is critical as you think about organizations evolving from being minimally involved and leaders being minimally involved in these decisions to being strategic partners. Finance and HR has a unique opportunity to be very involved in helping the leaders within the organizations ensure that they have the data they need to make decisions, that they have the tools to make those decisions, and they can really help support and provide insight to be much more strategic and much more problem solving versus finding problems after the fact. Next is around business controls. Historically, business controls were not as embedded into the process. And what we're seeing within organizations now as you evolve within your processes around reporting, those controls are much more embedded, and you're very aware of the cost and sensitive to that cost benefit sensitivity, right? There is obviously always a cost of controlling and building out new processes, but there's a lot of we've seen a lot of benefits by investing the time up front to build out controls in these processes, to really and embed them into the process. So as people begin to get more advanced in reporting, it's more involved and it's more embedded in how they look at reporting. Finally, reporting has been historically very focused on data collection, very hierarchical driven, and technology constrained, to be honest, right? Now, as with tools and platforms and the ability of data out there, you're seeing data that's much more relevant to the business, and that it's very integrated into the processes that you're building out within your organization. And then finally, the data and transaction processing. We have continued to evolve and will continue to evolve just the speed at which data can be processed and the speed in which it's available. It's gotten much more streamlined, and it's enabled organizations to evolve from being more reactive to being predictive in the way in which they start to look at their information. So as you start to think about the people and financial data, it's historically been very siloed. However, people and financial information is very intertwined and very interrelated. As you think about this people data, you're really focused on talent, worker, retention, development, productivity, and employee engagement data. From a financial perspective, you're really looking at the revenue, expenses, M&A, mergers and acquisition, cash flow, budget and forecast, and operational KPIs. Like I said from the beginning, historically, these have been very siloed and been very manual. But now, as you look at the systems that are out there, as well as the technology that's there to support and breaking down those silos, you're starting to see the ability to really marry together this rich people and financial data to make much better decisions about the business. And historically, kind of looking at it in such a way where it's much more than kind of talent data, or it's much more than those financial data, kind of individual piece parts. It's really combining those two, and also with your operational data, to really understand and kind of drive better metrics and reporting, and ultimately more predictive reporting, with the ability to kind of marry those areas together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who's going to drive a little bit more deeper in these areas.
Thank you, Mike. So with regard to data about our employees and our organizations, what we see is that a typical HR system has hundreds of measures, or KPIs or data elements that it's tracking, and those aren't actually even really tracked or reviewed by the teams. So they're just not using those elements or those KPIs because they're not business impacting and not impacting decision making. So we've kind of outlined some steps that organizations can take to begin the process of identifying more meaningful KPIs, and we're going to provide some insights into what we feel are some KPIs that you're maybe familiar with, just taken to the next level. So, in particular related to our employee and employee information, instead of just looking at information at a point in time, obviously trending that information, like a 5-year salary trend, is meaningful information, and then benchmarking that data against other organizations in a peer set or group are important to understanding, are you growing salaries faster than your peer set organizations? Are you growing salaries fast enough? How does that impact your employee retention and your ability to attract and retain talent? So having more meaningful information that can allow you to then make business impacting decisions is important. So with that said, the next way to take your data and information to the next level is to really start to think about how to combine some historical measures that you may have taken and take your financial data and your human or employee type data, and then start to integrate those together. So these are some KPIs that we wanted to share out that are really where the information can intersect. So measures such as revenue per FTE, cost per FTE, labor cost per FTE, understanding what your profit is per FTE, relative to recruiting, open revenue positions as a percentage of headcount. These are direct intersections of your financial data with your HR data, and can hopefully lead to more meaningful business decisions if tracked. And it's not just tracking it at a moment of time or as of this particular moment, trending that information where you can see changes in your organization and how that maybe compares to benchmarking or other companies in your peer set. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Joe for the next polling question.
Well, thank you so much, Lori and Mike. And as Lori mentioned, we will pose the second of 3 polling questions. Our second polling question asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement that at your company, finance and HR teams work together effectively to evaluate your company's workforce. And what you're welcome to do, as with our first polling question, is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button so we can record your response. And from top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. And once again, we do ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer. Click on the submit button so we can record the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement that at your company, finance and HR teams work together effectively to evaluate your company's workforce. I would note that following our revealing the responses to this poll, we will launch into a discussion with Lori and Mike of PwC and with Chris of Workday. But first, I do want to give attendees just one more second, and then we will reveal how you have responded and what we can see from among respondents to this question. It is a slim majority who, at the very least, agree. A relatively slim majority. I would acknowledge that about 30% or close to 30% of respondents disagree, and perhaps equally telling is the percentage who don't know, not too far from about a sixth of respondents who don't know. So I think the need for greater knowledge and greater collaboration is key, and that's what we're going to consider during our discussion, which we are now going to begin. I'm pleased to launch into our discussion with Lori, Mike, and Chris. And I'd like to pose our first question. I'm going to actually pose this question to you, Lori. I'd like to get your perspective, Lori, on the types of data finance and HR teams rely on to identify key performance indicators for employees. You've already alluded to some of these, but wanted to get some additional perspective on these performance indicators.
Yes, thank you, Joe. What we are seeing is companies are beginning to bring together disparate data sources and use those data sources to create new KPIs and provide more meaningful, more actionable KPIs for the business. So I'll use an example. Traditional KPIs leverage data that was available to that department or that cost center. So where I think leveraging data and taking it to the next level is really being able to leverage data from disparate sources. So, traditionally companies have tracked a measure such as turnover, but more meaningful or actionable information may be derived from something such as first-year turnover or high performer turnover. Those, one can just kind of see, okay, well, if my high performers are turning over, we want to retain our top talent. What actions from a business side do we need to take in order to retain our top talent? Or do they not have, a path forward to promotion? You can start to use other measures in connection with those to understand underlying your business if you have a problem that needs to be solved. Or things like first-year turnover. Is that a problem with your recruiting? Are you not attracting the right talent? Or is it a different problem? Are you getting great talent in, but they don't really like, or maybe you didn't properly discuss what was actually going to be when they got there. So those are the kinds of things. I think that this is just an example of a way that you can take kind of a traditional measure of turnover and make it more actionable or meaningful to the business.
That's a really great point, Lori. And what I appreciate is the need for precision, and it depends on the organization. But I think what I'm understanding then is that one has to be more precise, because the more precise one can be in outlining what turnover we're referring to, the more likely it is one can respond and determine what the action is. Is that right?
That's correct, Joe.
Oh, thank you. Now, we are shortly going to hear from Chris of Workday. We were noting that some of our conference rooms are named after Broadway shows. I just want to assure everybody we are not in the Sweeney Todd room, so when we talk about employee turnover, don't want anyone to be alarmed. Anyway, Chris, I understand you have some thoughts you'd like to share in response to this question, and then I have another question, Chris, that I'll pose to you.
Well, thank you, Joe. I was just listening to Lori. And I seem to think of that as a lot of top-level information that, the data that she has. But I also like to go a little deeper to what is that secondary and sometimes buried in those files that people have on their employees. For example, if I've got some people who are top performers, they bring in more revenue, they have fewer errors, but if I can find that commonality, did they all have the same type of degree? Did they all go to the same college or university? Or is it a very disparate, working set? Are they all the same generation? So, when we're looking at the data that is certainly for key performance, you've got the ones that we always look at, but, to have access, easy access to deeper, richer data that really might help you make more and better hiring decisions is something that I would think, taking this to that next level.
Exactly. And, to your point about access to information, that's not necessarily something that an organization can take for granted. And so I wanted to follow up on, Chris, on your response to this question by posing our next question to you. And that is a question about barriers in terms of access and in terms of sharing. What organizational barriers, Chris, in your observation, have traditionally prevented finance and HR teams from collecting and then sharing data that they need to evaluate a company's workforce?
That is a great follow-on, Joe. My first thought is actual physical. I've seen some insurance companies, some banks, primarily not as much in investment management, where the teams are not just on different floors of the same building, but maybe especially in our larger companies, where they're in different buildings. I've even seen it where those buildings are in different cities. So you certainly, with that geography, even in our virtual world, it becomes more difficult for a lot of companies to share that data. I have in my filing cabinet my stuff, and you have it in yours, and they just never compete. Another barrier, of course, is the fact that I just mentioned, the infamous filing cabinet. My goal would be for a financial services company to never buy another file cabinet, and we're not there yet. I think some of the other things is it hasn't been, we don't know each other that well. People who are HR professionals versus finance professionals seem to have very different personalities and interests. It's hard to find somebody who crosses a lot of times both, but we often almost need our IT people to be that bridge between those two languages, if you will. So other than maybe going to some senior management meetings, I don't maybe know my CFO or my CHRO, if I work in one or the other. We certainly aren't golfing buddies for the most part. That's very atypical in my experience. So, when they don't have those informal meetings. They don't go to lunch together. And of course, then the next thing I think about are our systems. It's traditional and very siloed buying processes, siloed business decisions to separate systems. So if you're not bringing the information together at any kind of level, we don't have that personal relationship, I think you have some strong organizational barriers to sharing that data and even collecting it so that you get the financial impact as well as as Lori was talking about, those key indicators, as to what we're just not sharing the same body of information, and we've made it hard for each other.
Exactly. I appreciate your perspective. Once again, that was Chris of Workday. And then Mike from PwC, I understand you have some additional thoughts you'd like to add in response to this question.
Definitely. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Chris. I think the other one is there's a logical barrier as well. I think historically amongst the HR and finance organization, there hasn't been a desire to share information because a lot of it was deemed very confidential and very kind of proprietary to their groups. And I think now as you're seeing the systems evolve and the technologies in place to ensure that you have the right model and security model and underlying data model in place that will support breaking down more of those logical barriers that have really enabled organizations to start to really kind of utilize that data across those functions. So I think that's the other thing, in addition to the physical and kind of call it system barriers, if you will. I think you see that logical barrier that has historically kind of been in place, and now you're starting to see both systems and processes kind of break that down in such a way where people still feel comfortable that it's controlled.
Mike, this is Chris again. Yeah, and Joe, I really think that's a great point that Mike brings out, that people have been afraid almost to share the data. You know, this is HR data. We have our privacy rules. This is financial data. You know, we don't want it getting out. And not realizing that for the betterment of the business, and of course with the right security frameworks, but it helps, of course, if you don't have to have multiple security frameworks, which those systems do. But you realize that for the good of the business at some level within the company, certainly this information, there's power, almost a multiplier in sharing that information with each other and really getting to information. You know, we always talk about data, and one of my pet peeves is data is not information. And if I have a lot of data, I need to get information, and a lot of times that takes bringing together many data points to create the information for good business decisions.
Exactly, exactly. And you know, to your point that there may be circumstances where it is not always possible to share every piece of information, or rather when it is initially starting out as data. And also to your point that distinguishing between data and information, I think one key thing is making sure that information that is available to finance and HR teams is information that they are able to use to inform decisions throughout a company. And Mike, I'd like to return to you in posing our next question, which is how can finance and HR teams work together and with other departments to gather, initially it's going to start off as data that they require to then transform that data, one, into usable information, actionable information, and then ultimately be able to gauge employees' performance. What do you recommend?
Well, I think first and foremost, starting with the end goal in mind by understanding what information is needed and designing a process and a data model that supports that end goal. I think many times we all start off thinking that we need to define a process, and kind of the data or the information falls on the back, right? And then all of a sudden we're scrambling to try to figure out how do you use that information to make good decisions. But I think what we're seeing is the best process is really to start with what do you need, what pieces of nuggets of information do you need to run your organization, and how do you define that process in such a way that will really give you what you need to make those decisions. Next, I think breaking down those barriers or those silos. I think we're seeing more and more organizations beginning to really do this, but that is critical, right? Just getting people in the same room to have those same conversations is critical. And then finally, going in with the assumption that reporting is going to be an iterative and an evolving process. You're not going to get it right the first time. What you want to make sure, though, is that you define your processes and your tools to support your reporting so that they're flexible enough that allows you to be adaptive. And you see perfect examples of companies that have been able to adapt to the market versus which companies that have not been able to adapt to the market. I mean, if you go back to Blockbuster many years ago, Blockbuster was a great example of a very successful organization that filled a need at a point in time. However, Netflix came along and made that process of getting a DVD to an end user that much simpler. And then what Netflix has continued to do is really evolve into a completely different organization that now, instead of distributing content, they're creating their own content. It's very similar to how you can set up and divide and evolve your reporting process. What the information that you need now probably is not the exact same information that you're going to need 3 years from now or 3 months from now to make decisions, and you have to define a system and tools that enable you to really be adaptive and be iterative in how you think about reporting.
Absolutely, and this leads to a question, a follow-up question, Mike. There's often temptation to think of headcount as something that is strictly definable in terms of salaries, quantities, in other words. But to your point about Blockbuster, or to use that example, if one sees a trend, let's say a business trend, that would certainly inform decisions about the skills an organization would need. For example, the ability to develop content rather than devise a way to distribute it. So with that in mind, are you finding that companies are recognizing the connection between the data that they gather and decisions that they make about not only their current workforce, but the type of skills they'll need in the future from their workforce?
Most definitely. I mean, that is, if you just think about, it's not necessarily about headcount reduction, and it's not necessarily about it's about evolving your organization. And that evolving of the organization could be bringing external resources to supplement the organization that you have in place today, or retooling the organization that you have. So PwC is a perfect example. We've embarked on a significant campaign within our organization to really upskill our organization on the digital front. And it's all about really arming people with the right information so that we can be the best partner for our clients. And the data supported that, both internally and externally. It showed that we were seeing trends in the market to where things were going from a digital perspective, and some of the trends that organizations were embarking on. And we saw that where we had an opportunity with our organization to really leapfrog our knowledge base. So it's very true that data can enable you to both adjust your organization, both from how you need to change from bringing in external sources of either people or support, whatever that might be, but also the ability to retool that organization and ultimately track within the organization if that's successful, and that retooling is something that people have really have enabled them to grow, and also it's proven to be something that is working in the way in which you planned it to be.
Exactly, and the fact that you could plan to begin with, that's wonderful. I know, Chris, you wanted to follow up on Mike's response to this question.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Mike's organization, Lori's organization, PwC, one of these firms that really helps, identify where firms are going, I think is very, very helpful. I try to keep up on all their literature. And truly, where we say that, 40-50% of the jobs that exist today won't exist in the future. That somebody starting a computer science degree today in university is going to be, some of those skills are going to be lost or not needed before they even graduate. Now, I almost think that Moore's Law, that great insight that, with the technology changes and with chips changing, that every 18 months there was going to be, that change in technology, almost seems, given how technology dependent we are on so many skilled jobs today, that's almost going into the human psyche of that. So that, we do need to constantly retool. And it is hard. Financial services is a very traditional business. And I think the fact that they can gather the data to get information and realize that, their employees of today will not necessarily be the same skills. The employees might be the same, but the skill levels needed and the retraining and the retooling, they need to have that workforce planning so that they know it's not just people, but I'm actually planning for skills as well.
Exactly. And actually, this leads to, so thank you, Chris and Mike. This leads to a question I'm going to pose to Lori. Lori, I want to return to you, following up on our previous questions, in terms of the role that finance and HR leaders can play in using, again, it's going to start off as data initially, using the data their teams collect to then, one, transform it into information that's actionable, and then ultimately inform decisions to plan for the future, specifically how to recruit and retain top talent.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Just to kind of bring forward the conversation we were just having, where Chris was talking about skills and needing to recruit for certain skills, I think that becomes increasingly important as our workforce change. I mean, right now, or historically, companies have struggled to get their disparate data into one place. Now, let's say you implement a tool or you have a methodology or a process for getting it in one place. You can have the conversations that Mike was talking about where you get into the room and start talking about how to bring those disparate data sources to bear on your business-facing problems. But maybe it becomes less difficult for or time-consuming for your employees to actually be able to perform those calculations because they're not performing those calculations manually. You get those tools together, you get the data into one place, you get the tools implemented to help you make those calculations. Now you have those calculations available to you, and you can then begin to use that data and trend it and see what's happening with your business. So, for example, if you are, in the past, we have really, really struggled to, you had mentioned earlier, Joe, headcount. That can be, you think that's an easy measure. Well, are we including that? Are we including part-time employees, full-time equivalents? What if you don't have all that information within your organization? What if there are pieces of your organization that you don't have onboarded into a common system? So those are where organizations have been slowed in the past, and getting that one data source of truth into a common place and allowing people to pull that information is the first step, I think, in having more meaningful information. So just getting that disparate information into a common system, being able to consistently apply those calculations so that things like trends can be analyzed, and then allowing that information to be used across departments and teams is the best way to move effectively forward. So in the turnover example I was using earlier, first-year turnover or high performer turnover might provide different insights into the business than what just a simple turnover measure that maybe only the HR team is ever looking at. What if that was sliced and diced by cost center? What if those cost center managers then understood what their turnover looks like, and you could view that trend over time? Maybe that helps you with employee engagement and other things in terms of trying to figure out how to retain and to recruit top talent. So, additional KPIs that we've kind of that are important for recruiting and retaining top talent are things like time to fill positions. If we have open positions but we're not able to fill them in a timely basis, that has meaningful business impact. What if that is a revenue, what if that is a revenue-facing position? How is that impacting my top line? That's where you can bring that finance information together with the information from historically human or employee type data and start to make it more meaningful. So not just having the open positions, but are your offers being accepted? What if your offer acceptance rate is pretty low? Does that mean that you're not communicating well with other teams on the requirements for the position, and or that your compensation is it doesn't benchmark against other peers or other typical roles in the environment? So that kind of information can be meaningful in understanding how to recruit and retain top talent. Promotion rate. So maybe your high performers are turning because they don't have the ability to promote within, they don't have the ability to take another step up. So understanding how these, not just individual KPIs, but how what the trends mean to your business, and how that information can then be used collectively to provide better information. So, these are the kind of things I think that companies need to start thinking about, trying to take their data and information and take it to the next level. So hopefully we're spending less time just trying to consistently calculate this information, and we've used the tools and capabilities that are out there in the marketplace today to bring us forward. And so we spend less time calculating and more time analyzing, which goes right back to Chris's comment on, well, the skills of the people need to change, because I don't need someone that can make that calculation anymore. I need someone that can tell me what that calculation means to this business and help me understand how I can then take action to improve those things for my business.
Thank you, Lori. Now, before I pose actually a next question to Chris, I just want to follow up quickly, because one thing you've certainly brought up, we haven't talked directly about visualization, but the notion that one can juxtapose different metrics, for example, showing a connection or at least a relationship between, say, promotion rate and first-year turnover, or some other connection, let's say, having to do with headcount, let's say, and revenue. And obviously, correlation does not mean causation, but have you found that companies that you've worked with are more open or more able, better equipped to use visualization to demonstrate connections, or at least highlight potential connections between different metrics that may not be otherwise apparent?
I think that's an excellent point, Joe. Our clients are very busy. People do not, the days of having pages and pages of reports that people have to try to review and digest I think those days are over. I think, we see it from our clients. They certainly don't want us to come out with 50-page decks on, our firm's capabilities and things like that. So, when you're analyzing your business and you're on the, visualizations help people to digest that information more quickly, and they also help people to understand that. They may not need to see the precision of the actual math. They just may need to see that visualization and understand how that trends over time. So, I think that visualizations are absolutely more becoming a necessity in our current working days. People don't have time to just ingest, 50-page reports or 10 pages. Like having that information on a one-page scorecard or dashboard of some sort, that allows you to say, okay, how are we doing relative to these KPIs, and allowing us to then to easily ingest that information and understand visually. I can see whether or not I've had a change in my business, as opposed to, I may not remember or recall a precise percentage or amount from the last report. So I think visualizations are critical. They're absolutely critical, and if businesses want to compete, they're going to have visualizations in their organizations.
Well, thank you, Lori. We're now we've talked about using data and transforming that into information. Now we want to consider the skills of the finance and HR teams themselves. Chris, I want to pose this next question to you, to Chris of Workday. What training, skills, and resources do finance and HR teams need to measure a company's performance effectively, be effective in doing so, and also be effective in identifying opportunities for improvement?
Well, Joe, I'm going to go back to something Mike just said a few minutes ago, and that there's going to be change. So no matter how I answer this question, it may not be applicable. Those skills are going to change. So we're not going to know all of them today, because they're going to be different tomorrow. I think the training on what Lori was just talking about, visualization tools, either how to use them or how to read the data, and how to be able to use the data. Once as we've talked about, we start bringing it into a central location, one system, so you don't have those disparate systems. And you need to know how to interpret that. You need to, I think in terms of a resource that the culture of the business, maybe what I would say is the first resource you need, that you've got to have from a top down, that this is what we want to do, that we want to really focus and be willing to see things, that we realize that, these changes are impacting us today and we really do want to improve. We need to eliminate those silos, have more cross teams, so that we are, again, not just sharing the data, but understanding the depth of that data and what it means. These are going to be some new skills perhaps today. It's not that, I'll go learn Excel and now I can do this. But learning those visualization skills. Mike had a great point about reporting. To have reporting that is constantly evergreen as I'm trying to do more with the information that I've brought together. It's going to be a very iterative process in the training and the skills. And I would say that number one resource really is a system that you're not moving data constantly, you're not dependent on end-of-month information, that you don't have just lagging, but current information to do so. So there are a lot of resources that go into this, and then using them and being willing to change and not get locked into that, as Mike mentioned before, where we know that tomorrow might be different.
Absolutely. And just a quick follow-up on this. Mike, I understand you have some additional thoughts with regard to this question.
Yeah, and I think as you start to think about the organization and the skills, I think going in with the concept of, historically, we always sent people to training. We did a lot of knowledge transfer. I think what we're seeing and what you're finding is some of the most effective and successful people in this reporting space are really the ones that hold that quality of kind of wanting to go in and figure it out. Yes, it's important to train people on a tool, but it's, as I think we've all seen, going to a day, a week, or whatever training course around a technology is wonderful, and it gives you a foundation. But most of what you get and most of where you become effective and efficient in a tool is really around your ability to continue to kind of build your skills and learn on the job or learn by playing. So I think identifying people within the organization that exhibit that quality of kind of wanting to go in and figure out and wanting to learn something new and showing that desire, that historical desire to kind of get out of their comfort zone, those are really the type of people you want to target to really help build your reporting skills within your organization.
That's a great point, Mike. And I know, Chris, you had something to add with regard to that.
Right, and I meant to mention before, Mike reminded me, right now we've got 5 generations within the workforce. Everybody from boomers like myself to the digital natives that are just now coming out of college. And I think we all want to do that. I love that reporting, the playing, using, so it's almost more those emotional, that EQ versus IQ, that you've got to have the will to do this. But I would say, from a boomer perspective, don't count us out either. That we are very willing to learn those new tools. And as the workforce changes, we've got a lot of team effort that comes into almost that cross-generational team, as well as the cross-functional team between finance and IT and HR. Those are things that I think would really help the company move faster, quicker.
Absolutely. And then actually a quick follow-up, Chris, to your point, and actually, Mike, you can feel free to chime in as well. Starting with Chris and then Mike, often when one looks to develop a profile of somebody or a role that one is going to hire for within an organization, one often looks at a set of skills, and these skills are subject to change. To what extent, I'm curious about this, starting with Chris and then Mike, are you finding that, to use, and I'm referring to Mike's earlier example, that organizations are looking at traits or tendencies, behavioral tendencies, if you will, like curiosity, for example, such that they can see potential for development in an individual who has these traits? In other words, where do skills end and traits begin, and to what extent are organizations looking at that increasingly and making decisions about hiring and promotion, for example? I guess starting with Chris and then Mike.
No, that's an interesting question, Joe. What I really think is that when there were times of high unemployment, you saw that you had, people wanted I want you to have 5.2 years of this and, 3.4 of that. They got very specific, and they almost wanted somebody to fit into the job on day one exactly as that job was done today. And I think it's almost happened because of the lower unemployment rate, but I think it really is. You want to hire. I learned the hard way. If I hired for skills, I had about a 50-50 chance. If I hired for attitude, I had a 100% chance of a successful hire. And I think that really goes to the skills that you have in terms of, as I said before, the EQ. Things that we don't often think, communication skills, writing skills. I don't want somebody who only knows how to text write, who's writing this executive report or I'm putting in front of a very important client. So, we've got the cross generations, we've got the opportunity to really take a look at that. And the other thing I've noticed, even some commercials on TV, with a skills taxonomy. Somebody coming out of the military has great skills, but they don't translate necessarily to the civilian world. I had that myself when I came out of the Navy. You've got these great designators, but the civilian world doesn't understand those. So I think if you get hired for that personality, for your ability to learn, for your ability to grow and change, I think those are really going to go a long way towards the successful businesses of tomorrow and the more fulfilling job for those people who are filling those jobs. And happy employees make for happy customers.
Exactly. It's a great point. And I want to bundle this follow-up question into a last question, which I was going to pose a question to you, Mike. Anyway, I want to hear your thoughts about key points and also follow up on the previous question.
Yeah, maybe just quickly as a follow-up. I think in an ideal world, it would be the perfect combination of the exact skills that you're looking for as well as the ideal traits. But I think we all know that the reality is that it's very hard to find the perfect candidate and the perfect person all the time to fill a role. So I think what you're starting to see is that because of how the continuing evolution of technologies and how organizations are changing, I think identifying people with very strong traits to support where the organization is going a lot of times can be more successful or equally successful if you're depending on kind of what you're looking at. So I think it's a balance, right? I mean, I think in the real ideally you would have the perfect combination of both, but I think a lot of times it's very hard to find that exact combination. So I think just kind of leading to a couple key points to take away from before we move into the Q&A. I think one, as I think we've talked about kind of at depth throughout the discussion, is one, you're definitely seeing organizations are continuing to evolve, and you're seeing an evolution to be more strategic and using data to really drive good analysis and insights that's integrated across functions and systems within the organization. That's kind of part of their day-to-day processes. Second, it's critical to break down historical silos both from a physical, people, and systems perspective that have historically caused barriers. Next, it's very important to identify the data that you need, keeping in mind that data could come from a multitude of disparate sources. So you could be in finance, and historically you thought that you're dealing with your general ledger, but the reality is you're better off getting data from a third party or some type of benchmarking source. So kind of keeping in mind that there's a lot of places you can get good data. Fourth, the systems that are out there are really starting and helping organizations to break down those silos and pull together rich people and financial data to make better decisions. We saw those opportunities that Lori talked about at the beginning around how you can really pull together financial and HR data to really look kind of more broadly. So things like revenue per employees and things like that Lori talked about. And finally, I think it's important to enable organizations with knowledge and process and data and the technology to support them to be successful, and know that it's something that's going to continue to evolve, and it will be important for you to continue to assess where you are in each of those areas. And it's not something that it's one and done where you implement a new reporting technology and put some reports out there and you don't touch it for another year or 2 or 3. This is something that this evolution should be ingrained in your culture to really support kind of the changing business and economic climates and your organization climate.
Exactly. The ability to adapt is what's key, and that is an important attribute of a successful organization that is able to align financial and human capital. Now, what I'd like to do is, so thank you, Mike and Lori and Chris, I'd like to pose the third of our 3 polling questions. Our third polling question asks attendees, within what time frame, if any, does your company intend to provide training and resources to improve the ability of your finance and HR teams to measure your company's performance? And what you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are your company is already doing so this year, next year. If your company has no plans or you don't know, you can select the radio button that corresponds to each of these respective choices. Again, we do want to find out within what time frame, if any, your company intends to provide training and resources to improve the ability of your finance and HR teams to measure your company's performance. What we'll do is, with our first 2 polling questions, is give attendees sufficient time to respond. We'll then summarize how you have responded. I would acknowledge we have received some great questions. I don't think we've had the opportunity to address all of them during this webcast. We will plan to follow up on any remaining questions after this webcast, and we really do appreciate your joining us. But first, I would like to give attendees just a few more seconds to respond to this question. We will then reveal how you have responded and then wrap up. And what we can see, and this is actually really, really encouraging, among respondents to this question, we see that about a quarter or close to a quarter have indicated your company is already doing so, and it's a priority for companies if they're not already doing so. If not this year, then next year, about another about the same percentage. So roughly the same percentage for companies that are already doing so and those that are planning to do so either this year or next year. I would acknowledge, though, that there is a significant percentage, a plurality, who don't know, and that's fine. That's why you're here, and that's why we really appreciate your joining us for our webcast. Indeed, what I would like to do is let you know what will follow from this webcast. As I said, we will plan to follow up on any questions after this webcast. First of all, I would note that this webcast will be available on demand later this week within the webcast section of CFO.com. At that point, you'll be able to view and listen to a streaming archive of our webcast, download a PDF document that comprises slides from our webcast, click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person, and if you've responded to all 3 polling questions during our live webcast, retrieve your CPE certificate. I would note that for those who are joining our live webcast, at the end of our webcast, we will invite you to complete an online feedback survey. That feedback survey will be visible to you. You will be able to complete the feedback survey if you have turned off your pop-up blocker within your web browser, and as always, we appreciate your feedback. Once again, I would like to thank our very distinguished guests for joining us for our webcast, Lori and Mike of PwC and Chris of Workday. We really appreciate such an engaging and informative discussion. And we would like to thank attendees for joining us for our webcast, How CFOs and HR Leaders Collaborate to Align Financial and Human Capital, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Workday and PwC. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.